Are processed foods the problem, or is it the story we're talking about? Welcome back to Rooted and Restless. I'm Marianne Smith Edge, and today we're talking about a subject that is high on the headlines: ultra-processed foods in dietary guidelines. And I have the best guest to talk about processed foods today, known as America's favorite food scientist, Dr. Taylor Wallace, CEO of Think Healthy Group, LLC, based in Washington, D.C. And not only is he a food scientist, but we have a couple of things in common. He's a Kentuckian and a proud graduate of the University of Kentucky, just like myself. And we just might have time to talk about a little basketball after food processing. But most of all, Taylor. So Taylor, such a pleasure for you to be here with me today. I know we could go on for many minutes rather than just the time. But first of all, let's talk about processed foods. You and I have talked about it for a long time. So, in the 50s and 60s, processed foods was actually looked as quite an advantage for convenience and for women who were, quote, getting out of the kitchen into the workplace. But over the past several decades, we've seen that whole evolution of positive kind of change to a negative, especially recently around processed foods. What's happened? Where's the nuances when we talk about processed foods?
I think processed foods definitely reflect changes in society, right? In the 1950s, it was all about convenience, right? During and after World War II, more women were going to work. They weren't just homemakers. And so, you see a lot of processed foods offering that convenience in the home where there's, often multiple children. And then, evolutionary wise, if you look from that time on, you start to see the obesity epidemic begin to rise, particularly, in the 1970s when processed foods really, gained a lot of traction. You start seeing weight gain and then the emergence of various chronic diseases. And today you see, a big hype of processed foods in the media. I kind of equate processed foods and ultra processed food terminology to that of GMOs, organic, these other kind of catchphrases that are really, they're easy for people to grasp. So they're constantly in the media, but they don't really, from a scientific standpoint, explain what's happening. And in many situations, they distract the viewer or the consumer from what they actually should be doing with their diet to be more healthy.
And you raise a good point. I think some of the other terms that you used, it just adds to that fear factor of what not to eat rather than what to eat. So let's talk about processing. I know you and I, when I was in D.C., would have a lot of discussions. And years ago, when I was with the International Food Information Council, we did this whole concept of getting people to understand the different levels of processing. So, as a food scientist, explain a little bit more about, the processing. And, I would say when we talk about processed foods, is it really the level of processing, or is it the ingredients from within that really creates the issue? And you sort of alluded to that earlier.
Yeah, so, we have for example, solid evidence that a high intake of added sugars, saturated fat, sodium, and refined carbohydrates is not healthy for you. And so that is kind of regardless of the processing, right? You can process a fudge brownie in a facility and put it on a grocery store shelf, or you can go make a homemade brownie, and it's still the same brownie. It's still bad for you. Now, that brownie from the manufacturing facility probably has a mold inhibitor or an antimicrobial agent that makes it arguably a little more safe than the brownie you're making at home. But, that antimicrobial agent or that additive isn't really affecting health. I mean, if it is, it's like, a grain of sand on a beach. And the rest of the beach is like added sugar, saturated fat, refined carbohydrates, and sodium, right? So that's where ultra processed foods gets a little sticky. Like I said, it kind of puts the focus on something else where it should be focused on, mainly those four things: added sugar, saturated fat, refined carbohydrates, and sodium, in my opinion.
So, in addition to those common that we talk about, and you mentioned about the brownie that might have a mold inhibitor, I think there's been a lot of scare tactics over the last few years when people say don't buy anything or eat anything with an ingredient that you can't pronounce. Well, you and I both know that me rather than you, sometimes it's hard to pronounce even some of the official names of vitamins and different bioactives. That doesn't make them bad. It's just what's already in food. So I think the fact is, you're right. We've expected a certain quality of food when we buy it. But the reality, the quality is there because sometimes of the, as you said, mold inhibitors or even what we call emulsifiers. Tell us a little bit more about, that's been the advantage of having a shelf-stable food, is that should we be concerned about some of these ingredients or know that sometimes many of them are even made from other food products?
Right. So you have to keep in mind several things about food processing. One is the shelf life of the food and the stability of the food. So, for example, I just had real wasabi in Washington, D.C. in January. That is due to the effects of food processing. That we're able to have that global supply chain. And look, there's no way we're going to feed almost 9 billion people on this planet without processed foods or without food processing. It's an impossible thing to do at this point. Processed foods, offer a lot. And they kind of have gotten this bad rap. But if you look at things since the 1950s, for example, you see much lower rates of foodborne illness, death from, foodborne illness, major hospitalizations. And if you look current day at the food safety data, which we have a very good grasp on within the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and also within the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, what are the foods where you see people getting hospitalized from? They're whole foods. They're fresh produce, romaine lettuce. Everybody's seen what happens. You don't really see processed foods being an issue because they do contain those mold inhibitors, those antimicrobial agents, and they go through a lot of different processing steps that ensure their safety. And in some cases, you actually see processed foods having a nutritional benefit. I could argue a yogurt that has been made with live, cultures and fermented has some superior benefits. I could also argue that something like a pizza sauce, because it has added fat and it's been, exposed to heat, those carotenoids, like lycopene that we know are so good for you and can potentially prevent certain types of cancer, like prostate cancer in men. Those carotenoids are better absorbed from pizza sauce than they are a whole tomato because of that food processing and because of that unique matrix. So while it's easy to kind of put a negative umbrella around processed foods, in many instances, When you talk about getting fresh produce to Washington, D.C., in January, you really can't do that without, certain processing steps to ensure that that food lasts longer and is safe once it arrives. So, I think, we're not just living in this 1950s agrarian society where everything is local and we all go out and milk the cow every morning, like we all did in Kentucky. I did that as a young child. It's we could be getting our milk from, hundreds and hundreds of miles away. And so, you know, and that's due to this large population, right? We're spread out. Metropolitan areas are densely populated. And so we have to have a different supply chain in place to support that. And processed foods, and food processing really offer us the means of being able to do that and feed a population of almost 9 billion.
Well, I think you bring up a really good point there. There's been a lot of emphasis lately, especially as we rolled out the 2025 dietary guidelines for Americans, which we'll talk about, is that about real food. But frankly, as you just said, milk is real food, but it's processed. It has to be. And so we have to realize that, there's very few, if any, foods that we've always said that is not some level of processing, in that.
Well, it makes it very hard to define what is processing, what is an ultra processed food. A lot of people don't realize that these, I guess, unprocessed foods that we're recommending, like fruits and vegetables. I mean, there's antimicrobial agents when you go in the grocery store and you see the little sprayers spraying, liquid or water on the produce that has an antimicrobial agent in it, which would make it, at least according to the NOVA scale, qualify as a processed food. I mean, if you're washed, cut, bagged, if there's heat applied, I mean, there's so many different food processing techniques. Like you said, if you're not just, picking a vegetable out of your garden and then eating it dirty on the spot, there's some type of food processing that's occurring.
So you mentioned NOVA, and I think that's been mentioned with the recent release of the dietary guidelines of talking about the NOVA classification, and hence has kind of led us to really dive into this whole ultra processed concept. I think you and I both have heard about probably 15 years ago or more about the NOVA classification, and it didn't start here in the U.S. So give me a little more insight from your perspective, where this whole process started. I think, if I'm correct, Brazil, but I'd be interested to think from your perspective, how did this move over into our conversation and now actually having perhaps some greater influence on how we describe what we're just talking about?
Right. Well, I think there's two issues. One is that, like I said, the term ultra processed food, people get it. That's something people can visualize, they understand it, and it's easy to kind of point the finger and say, aha, I've got the solution. And so the media tend to grab onto that. And it tends to, circulate online, especially with social media. The other thing that I think is less talked about is that as nutrition scientists, I kind of float between a food scientist and a nutrition scientist. My PhD is in food science. But my research has been on the nutrition side. And one thing that's very noticeable to me is that other nutrition researchers don't understand food processing. They don't understand processed foods. So you see a lot of these clinical studies, for example, where they classify foods using this NOVA system, which basically it classifies a food based on the level of processing, right? So there are, regular processed foods, and then there are these ultra processed foods. And I believe there's something, and don't quote me on this, but there's like a 5-ingredient rule. And then there's a list of food additives on their website. And if you have this food additive in there and you have more than 5 ingredients, then you're considered an ultra processed food. And there's a lot of, that's a pretty broad umbrella, right? And while it efficiently captures a lot of nutritionally undesirable products, it also captures some that are nutritionally quite desirable. I mentioned, yogurt as being one of them, or even a flavored yogurt that might be low in sugar, low in fat, something to that example. And, from a nutrition researcher perspective, you look at the clinical trials and where they give ultra processed foods, in one arm of the study, and, either minimally processed or less processed foods in another arm of the study. Well, what do you get? Well, if you look at the food supply, most ultra processed foods that you'll see on the grocery store shelf are not foods you'd really consider super healthy anyway. I don't think anybody is gonna argue that Twinkies and Cheez-Its and a ton of other ultra processed foods, following those examples, are super healthy. But where you get kind of limited in these studies is if you give somebody in one arm Twinkies and Cheez-Its, and in the other arm you give them apples and vegetables, and you say, oh, it's ultra processed foods that are the issue. Well, not really. I mean, you just gave somebody a lot of refined carbohydrates, added sugar, saturated fat, and over here you gave somebody fresh fruits and vegetables. It's not really the processing that's the issue here. We're comparing apples and oranges. So I think, part of this is, there is no standard definition for ultra processed foods. We have this kind of NOVA categorization that's caught on because nutrition researchers don't really understand food processing or food science, or how supply chains work, and how and why certain ingredients are added to food. Nor do I really think we fully understand the effects of a lot of these additives in food. I'll say that. I think that a lot of these food additives and things in food could have more research behind them. However, there is, I'd say, probably 95% of the additives added to food. I mean, it's a pretty short list, right? You have your mold inhibitors, your antimicrobials, your emulsifiers, your texturizers, there's a very, kind of short list of additives. Now there's some specialty ones that, novelty companies, put in there. I'll add that a lot of those are in these kind of new natural, foods that we market kind of as this less processed, but that can also have a lot of crazy stuff in it. And so you have, like this short list, and there's a fair amount of research in, that 95% of additives that they really don't cause any harm. Or like I said, you can look at it like a grain of sand on a beach. Okay, the beach is like the obesity epidemic. It's saturated fat, added sugar, refined carbohydrates, and sodium. And the additives are like a grain of sand on a beach. So do they matter? Maybe it's just noise. Probably not. We, like you said, we've been using them since the 1950s. We would have probably noticed if there was a big issue by now. So, it's, again, getting people back to what they should be thinking about versus the easy message, because that's what fad diets do, right? Is, oh, that's the issue. The issue is dairy. The issue is GMOs. The issue is this. The issue isn't me eating 3 boxes of Cheez-Its. The issue is the additive in the Cheez-Its, which just, kind of takes away from, the overall goal, which is to get people to eat better and eat right.
Well, I think you've given some great insight when we talk about it, because it used to be we really didn't call it processed one way or the other, but we were, it was junk food or not junk food. And the reality is, again, it's not how it's processed, perhaps, but as you said, it's kind of the old sugar, fat, and salt concept in that regard. Now, let's hear from Mindy Herman, registered dietitian, food and nutrition writer, and a guru on all the latest food trends.
Hi, Marianne. Here's a quick trends minute on processed foods. As you know, the newly released U.S. dietary guidelines call for avoiding highly processed foods, especially ones that are high in added sugars or salt. That's a heavy lift. According to the CDC, adults in the U.S. get over half their calories from ultra-processed foods, many of which are high in sugars or salt. According to Innova Market Insights new product launch data in the U.S., new product launches for a sweet category, cakes and cookies, are up 30% between 2024 and 2025. Launches of salty snacks are up over 20%. Wow! But here's the good news. Over 1/3 of U.S. consumers surveyed by Innova are trying to cut down on added sugars and on salt.
Now, let's return to our conversation. So, one question is as we look at this whole concept of ultra-processed, and I would say you and I both could, even though we probably have very similar, is that we might describe it differently, and we have some knowledge behind that. So it's going to be probably difficult on the definition. But what might be labeled and classified, and you alluded to this in some foods as an ultra-processed food, but actually is quite helpful, and has more nutrients than it and positive for us. And what's some things that is a good example not to always consider processing as the way to define food?
Some real easy ones. Yogurt. Some people disagree with that, but if you really look at the composition of a yogurt, it's, an ultra processed food. It's definitely got, an antimicrobial agent in it. Usually it's got a preservative in it. It's got a handful of ingredients that go into it. So it's an ultra processed food. The other thing that I consume, almost daily, because I try to go to the gym and stay active, are protein powders. If you look at protein powders, they're fortified with, different vitamins and minerals. It takes quite a bit of effort to get that protein, extracted and concentrated. Usually there's a chocolate flavoring that's added to it. Again, you've got mold inhibitors, so that when it's sitting in the big tub, it doesn't grow mold or, anything like that. So it would be considered an ultra processed food. So again, lots of things could potentially be ultra processed foods, but nutritionally desirable. And, when you look at processing, what's our number one recommendation in the nutrition field? It's to eat more fruits and vegetables. In case you haven't noticed, fruits and vegetables go bad very quickly unless you package them and you add some of these, antimicrobial agents or preservatives, things like that, to keep them fresh for longer. And then we can get them to more people. And also, if you look at things like frozen foods, like if you take frozen strawberries, for example, they're riper. And so they're picked at their peak ripeness, which we know offers some nutritional advantage. And they're cheaper and more convenient, right? Because you can open the bag, close it up, put it back in your freezer. So again, those are all benefits of food processing, giving opportunities to get strawberries, that don't taste like, a sour grape in Washington, D.C. in January.
So I think it comes down to common sense that sometimes we lose a little bit of that with the headlines, is that what you just said is it's still about having adequate food, safe food, accessible, and frankly affordable. And processing allows for that, as you mentioned, but it also allows us to eat how we've now decided we wanted to eat year round, that we want fruits and vegetables year round, and through all those methods, just like we did at home. I grew up on a farm as well, so we canned and froze those foods that were grown in the garden. Guess what? We processed it. So, so a couple of quick questions: is a homemade cookie or a homemade cake more processed or less than if I bought it from a bakery, or if I bought it from a food company?
Well, so that's in itself a pretty complex question, right? So, as a food scientist, we have to take some of the heat for processed foods, because we have made, foods, very ultra palatable. Now, I don't know if that necessarily is like we're trying to make you addicted to foods. I'm not really convinced that any of my, 400 or 500 food science friends are doing that. Most of them are very ethical people. But, when you have a competitor product that tastes better, you try to match that product. If you try to lower the sodium in, for example, Campbell's tomato soup, you almost bankrupt the company, because nobody buys reduced sodium products because they think it tastes, it tastes worse than, comparable products. So I think, there's always this economic market advantage where food companies, want to do better. And you see many of them, like Kraft, that are developing really novel ingredients that, for example, can polymerize different simple carbohydrates into fiber in the gut, and prevent some of that sugar from being absorbed. There's some really neat technologies that are being developed, and in my mind, food science is the issue. It is the solution here. It's not the issue, it's the solution to the problem, because the population is only going to continue to grow. We're only going to continue to have more of a global food supply. And then I think the other piece of this, kind of going back to what you said, growing up on the farm, we had a big garden, and, I grew up on a cattle farm that was also a tobacco farm in Kentucky, and that's hard work. Alongside, those, home gardens and, home cooking and being on the farm, it's a lot of hard work and physical activity. And I think we've lost a lot of that as we've, got into this office environment, where we're sedentary. And so it's not just about nutrition. It's about this balance between physical activity, sleep, stress, kind of a whole lifestyle.
You're so right. Having a father that was a dairy farmer for 51 years, calories, it was more about how many he could take in, and obviously ate healthy. But after he retired, you could definitely see he couldn't continue, even though he was much older, he couldn't continue at the intake, because guess what? He wasn't working those 16 hours a day. So it's the old adage is not only what you take in, but of course what you burn as well, for sure. Taylor, you've given us such good insights. One quick soundbite about processed foods for people and thinking about should they feel concerned, or should they feel like a sense of comfort when they go into a grocery store?
Well, I'd say that food processing isn't the issue. It's the types of processed foods that people are purchasing and consuming. And I also, I'll take it back to a personalized nutrition approach. If you're a pregnant woman and you really want to protect that baby, and get, all of your nutrients and things like that, processed foods have a lot to offer in the safety space, and a lot of them are fortified with nutrients we wouldn't get from just consuming whole foods that are, just laying around here in Washington, D.C. in January, which is pretty limited. So if you're thinking about that, like if you're an older adult, older adults don't consume, as much quantity of food. Protein powders, protein bars, things that are easily palatable, like, because older people have dental issues. So, it's all about your personal situation and how comfortable you are. At 41 years old and healthy, I'm not super concerned about, if I get foodborne illness. That might change in 20 years. If I had a young infant in the house, that might be very different than, my son's now 9 years old, super healthy, he fights off, sickness and has pretty good immunity. And so it just depends on, your family and your personal situation. And I want people to look at processed foods as being advantageous to their personal situation. And also, again, just being practical. The Cheez-Its aren't bad because they're a processed food. And I will say extra cheesy Cheez-Its are my favorite.
Your guilty pleasure.
I pick on them because I love them so much. And also, if you put them in the refrigerator, it makes the MSG and inositol. They have synergy, and it'll blow your brains out. They're so good.
Oh, great tip. Now, in that regard, of course, I really don't like Cheez-It, but there's a few others. Occasional chip is not a bad thing. Yeah. Well, thanks, Taylor. We'll wrap it up very quickly. What's some new food science, new research, nutrition research that's on the horizon for you?
We just finished our the Sacmolo project in Guatemala. It was published in The Lancet about 2 weeks ago. It's the largest randomized controlled nutrition intervention in middle and low income in the low and middle income country setting in 6-month-old infants during the complementary feeding period. We looked at how daily egg intake could affect both child development, whether it is from the cognitive standpoint or growth. We're just about to undertake another large epigenetic biological aging study where we'll be giving young adults 30 to 45 years old a daily multivitamin, and we'll be looking epigenetically at the rate of aging in those individuals to see if good nutrition can impact rate of aging, or at least getting enough nutrients can impact your rate of aging over a 6-month time span. So we've got some pretty neat stuff in our lab that has just come out, and some stuff that's on the horizon as well.
So it sounds like eggs are okay.
I love eggs. I'm a choline researcher, and we've done a lot of work in this area. We had some research just published in Journal of Nutrition where we showed adults that consume, a decent amount of eggs had a lower incidence of developing Alzheimer's dementia later in life. So makes sense. Choline is part of that neurotransmitter acetylcholine, and we know that Alzheimer's disease is cholinergic related, and depletion of that cholinergic system is prevalent in Alzheimer's. And we also think that it's one of the reasons that women are much more predisposed to Alzheimer's in late life, because a lot of that cholinergic function is due to loss in estrogen, because women produce choline in the body and it follows estrogen. When they stop producing choline or estrogen, they stop producing choline. And so we think that degradation of the cholinergic system in women during the menopause transition might be a reason that they have a higher rate of Alzheimer's later in life. And we're doing some work in that area right now. We've just published some observational research, but we're continuing that work as we speak. So pretty exciting stuff. And yes, I think eggs are a nutrition powerhouse.
Well, I think Taylor, you've just hit on a subject that I need to have you come back later on so we can really talk in this, because obviously a subject very near to dear to my heart, and I'm just a few years older than you, so obviously aging and keeping mentally alert is extremely important. So before we say goodbye, quick question: we both have blue on. Is UK going to be in the mix in March Madness, or is it just another year?
Ooh, I think I think we're gonna squeak by.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. Thank you, Taylor. Such always wonderful to catch up, and thank you for all your insight on processing, and then some of your new research findings that will continue the conversation. I hope our conversation today with Taylor provided a little more insight into, quote, processed foods. Suddenly we've used the term process as something negative, and yes, it did seem to be emphasized during a certain ad at the recent Super Bowl highlights and advertisements. But reality remembers, just as we talked about. Processing itself doesn't determine the nutrient quality of food. Yogurt, frozen vegetables, plant-based burgers, all processed in different ways. And yes, there are different types of process. As a dietitian, the quality of yogurt is a little different than a snack food, or what we would call junk food. But rest assured, the reality is that let's not think about whether it was processed. Think about what's in the food. What's in the food can definitely affect our health, not just whether it was processed or not. Because after all, unless you're eating the tomato out of your garden, everything we eat is processed. Thank you for listening, Rooted and Restless. It's all about digging deeper into the behind the scenes about food, agriculture, and nutrition. Because after all, every food has a story, and sometimes it's not as simple as it seems. Subscribe to Rooted and Restless wherever you listen to podcasts, or find us on YouTube.